Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon in the Kleine Comedie. On behalf of the John Adams Institute and Publishing House Anthos, welcome this afternoon with Donna Tartt. Donna will be introduced by Pieter Steinz, journalist with NRC Handelsblad. He will have an introduction of about 10 minutes. In about an hour, there will be a short intermission. Thank you and enjoy your afternoon.
This Sunday, does my microphone work? Can you all hear me? This Sunday is Donna Tartt's 7th day in Holland, or rather in Amsterdam, for if we may believe her, she hasn't seen much more than the inside of her hotel. Still, if Donna Tartt doesn't know Holland, we can say that Holland knows Donna Tartt by now. Hardly a paper in which she hasn't appeared. She's been interviewed by almost every paper in Holland. There were reports at the Boekenbal on which she, and not a Dutch author, was the big star. We had a Dutch diary in NRC Handelsblad yesterday. She was on TV with Karel van der Graaf, and now she has sold out the Kleine Comedie. Almost as fast as Joep van het Hek, and he is Holland's most popular stand-up comedian, a pop star. Why is Donna Tartt such a big star? Donna Tartt is the writer of a surprising debut novel. But even before The Secret History was actually published half a year ago in September 1992, she was already a household name, not to say a legend, among critics, publishers, and other literary professionals. Donna Tartt was what one calls, with a hideous word, a media hype. She got the biggest advance for her first novel, $500,000 from publisher Knopf. She got the same amount for the paperback rights to her novel. She sold the film rights almost immediately to her novel to a director who is very famous, Alan Pakula. And then there was the enormous number of advanced reader copies that were sent out to critics months before the novel was actually published. 10,000 people say, 100,000 people say, this was only the advanced readers' copies, and the number kept growing with every time people were talking about it. Then, in September 1992, The Secret History was published, and turned out to be an incredible success, and an immediate success. Not because of what was called the Knopf star-making machine, but because critics and journalists all over the world were pleasantly surprised by what? First, here was a young author, and she was publishing a debut novel of 500 pages with an original murder plot that was accessible to a wide reading audience, despite the fact that in it was a lot of Greek philosophy. The novel was in fact a combination of Greek tragedy and a crime novel. Very interesting indeed. If this all was enough to be just remarkable, Donna Tartt cultivated a mysterious image. From interviews and profiles in magazines like Vanity Fair, we heard that she was living alone in Manhattan with a pug named Pongo.
What's mysterious about that?
Well, okay. Okay, I build it up now. If you called her up, you would get a dead man on the phone. T.S. Eliot reading The Wasteland on her answering machine. That's something different from the regular "I'm not here now, you can leave a message after the beep." And then there was the publicity picture. I think it's the same picture that is used for this day, but I'm not sure. This was a woman who looked like she walked away from the set of Twin Peaks. And she was photographed against the background of a graveyard, and in the back of that graveyard there were some bare Douglas fir trees. It was a picture that, as everybody can see now, didn't resemble Donna Tartt very much. It was all enough to contribute to the myth, to the hype. But in the case of Donna Tartt, you can't say anything but do believe the hype. Enjoy it, for The Secret History is a great book. The Secret History has an exciting plot. It's a story you can't put down before you're finished. For those who haven't begun, and so have read on till the end, I will give a short summary. The Secret History is about 4 students in a prestigious liberal arts college in Vermont who let Greek culture go to their heads and decide to have a Greek bacchanal. During a successful Dionysian frenzy, they murder an innocent farmer, and that's a crime they have to cover up in the end by murdering a fellow student who knows too much. The story in The Secret History is told by a naive young man named Richard Papin, who becomes an accomplice in the second murder, the murder of Bunny, who gets killed because he knows too much. It's a sort of crime and punishment in an American college, and in this case more a crime and remorse novel. The Secret History was also a sensational book, but a book in which all the sensation, as in Greek tragedy, happens off stage. There are no direct murder or sex scenes, very strange in modern American literature, but still hardly a dull moment in The Secret History. And there is well-balanced suspense. You turn the pages until you are at the end. Also, psychologically, The Secret History is a very clever book. Not only because it traces the effects of a crime on a small group of students, they are coming apart because of remorse and nervousness in the end, but also because the reader is manipulated to sympathize with the elitist, murderous protagonists, and that's very clever to do. Secret History is also extremely well written. There are beautiful descriptions of campus life, of New England in the fall, and it is still a very good book when the suspense is gone. When you have read it already, you read it for a second time, and then you can enjoy it just as much. Something about the writer to introduce. Donna Louise Tartt was born in 1964 in Grenada, Mississippi. She went to the University of Mississippi at Oxford, and after that she went on to Bennington College, which is in Vermont and not very much unlike the college she describes in The Secret History. There at Bennington College she studied Greek philosophy and culture. Bennington was a good place for writers, as you can read in the handout given by the John Adams Institute today. Not as good as the John Adams Institute suggests here. There are not 25 writers in one class, which would be very much, but 5, and that was enough. One of those writers was Bret Easton Ellis. He was the writer of Less Than Zero, a novel which got a lot of acclaim in the 80s, and he's the man to which Donna Tartt co-dedicated her Secret History. Although there's a lot of drugs and young and beautiful people in The Secret History, Donna Tartt is not a writer you could place in the so-called Brat Pack of American literature, the young writers who wrote about yuppies like J. McInerney and Bret Easton Ellis. The Secret History could as well have been situated before the war or in the 19th century. It's a sort of timeless book. And although Donna Tartt is a writer from the South, she's not a Southern writer in the tradition of Twain and Faulkner, writing about race relations or the degeneration of Southern culture. She's a writer of her own. Who Donna Tartt is, we hope to find out this afternoon. I give the floor over to her. Done that.
Hi, well, thank you for such a nice introduction. Yes, thank you. I'm going to read from several different parts of my book, something from the very beginning, and some things toward the end, but it will all fit together and make sense, I promise you. The snow in the mountains was melting, and Bunny had been dead for several weeks before we came to understand the gravity of our situation. He'd been dead for 10 days before they found him, you know. It was one of the biggest manhunts in Vermont history. State troopers, the FBI, even an Army helicopter. The college closed, the dye factory in Hampton shut down. People coming from New Hampshire, upstate New York, as far away as Boston. It is difficult to believe that Henry's modest plan could have worked so well despite these unforeseen events. We hadn't intended to hide the body where it couldn't be found. In fact, we hadn't hidden it at all, but had simply left it where it fell in hopes that some luckless passerby would stumble over it before anyone even noticed he was missing. This was a tale that told itself simply and well. The loose rocks, the body at the bottom of the ravine with a break in the neck, and the muddy skid marks of dug-in heels pointing the way down. A hiking accident, no more, no less. And it might have been left at that, at quiet tears and a small funeral, had it not been for the snow that fell that night. It covered him without a trace. And 10 days later, when the thaw finally came, the state troopers and the FBI and the searchers from town all saw that they had been walking back and forth over his body until the snow above it was packed down like ice. It is difficult to believe that such an uproar took place over an act for which I was partially responsible. Even more difficult to believe I could have walked through it. The cameras, the uniforms, the black crowd sprinkled over Mount Cataract like ants in a sugar bowl, without incurring a blink of suspicion. But walking through it all was one thing. Walking away, unfortunately, has proved to be quite another. And though once I thought I had left that ravine forever on an April afternoon long ago, now I am not so sure. Now the searchers have departed, and life has grown quiet around me. I have come to realize that while for years I might have imagined myself to be somewhere else, in reality I have been there all the time, up at the top by the muddy wheel ruts in the new grass, where the sky is dark over the shivering apple blossoms, and the first chill of the snow that will fall that night is already in the air. "What are you doing up here?" said Bunny, surprised, when he found the four of us waiting for him. "Why, looking for new ferns," said Henry. And after we stood whispering in the underbrush, one last look at the body and a last look round, no dropped keys, lost glasses, everybody got everything, and then started single file through the woods, I took one glance back through the saplings that leapt to close the path behind me. Though I remember the walk back and the first lonely flakes of snow that came drifting through the pines, remember piling gratefully into the car and starting down the road like a family on vacation, with Henry driving clench-jawed through the potholes and the rest of us leaning over the seats and talking like children. Though I remember only too well the long, terrible night that lay ahead and the long, terrible days and nights that followed, I have only to glance over my shoulder for all those years to drop away, and I see it behind me again, the ravine, rising all green and black through the saplings, a picture that will never leave me. I suppose at one time in my life I might have had any number of stories, but now there is no other. This is the only story I will ever be able to tell. Just for the record, I do not consider myself an evil person, though how like a killer that makes me sound. Whenever I read about murders in the news, I am struck by the dogged, almost touching assurance with which interstate stranglers, needle-happy pediatricians, the depraved and guilty of all descriptions, fail to recognize the evil in themselves, feel compelled even to assert a kind of spurious decency. Basically, I am a very good person. This from the latest serial killer, destined for the chair, they say, who, with an incarnadine axe, recently dispatched half a dozen registered nurses in Texas. But while I've never considered myself a very good person, neither can I bring myself to believe that I am a spectacularly bad one. Perhaps it's simply impossible to think of oneself in such a way, our Texan friend being a case in point. What we did was terrible, but still I don't think any of us were bad exactly. Chalk it up to weakness on my part, hubris on Henry's, too much Greek prose composition, whatever you like. I don't know. I suppose I should have had a better idea of what I was letting myself in for. Still, the first murder seemed to have been so simple, a dropped stone falling to the lake bed with scarcely a ripple. The second one was also easy, at least at the first, but I had no inkling how different it would be. What we took for a docile, ordinary weight, gentle plunk, swift rush to the bottom, dark waters closing over it without a trace, was in fact a depth charge, one that exploded quite without warning beneath the glassy surface, and the repercussions of which may not be entirely over, even now. Toward the end of the 16th century, the Italian physicist Galileo Galilei did a variety of experiments on the nature of falling bodies, dropping objects, so they say, from the Tower of Pisa in order to measure the rate of acceleration as they fell. His findings were as follows: that falling bodies acquire speed as they fall, that the farther a body falls, the faster it moves, that the velocity of a falling body equals the acceleration due to gravity multiplied by the time of the fall in seconds. In short, that, given the variables in our case, our particular falling body was traveling at a speed greater than 32 feet per second when it hit the rocks below. You see then how quick it was. And it is impossible to slow down this film, to examine individual frames. I see now what I saw then, flashing by with the swift, deceptive ease of an accident. Shower of gravel, windmilling arms, a hand that claws at a branch and misses. A barrage of frightened crows explodes from the underbrush, cawing and dark against the sky. Cut to Henry, stepping back from the edge. Then the film flaps up in the projector and the screen goes black. Consummatum est. If, lying in my bed at night, I find myself unwilling audience to this objectionable little documentary, it goes away when I open my eyes, but always when I close them, it resumes tirelessly at the very beginning. I marvel at how detached it is in viewpoint, eccentric in detail, largely devoid of emotional power. In that way, it mirrors the remembered experience more closely than one might imagine. Time and repeated screenings have endowed the memory with a menace the original did not possess. I watched it all happen quite calmly, without fear, without pity, without anything but a kind of stunned curiosity, so that the impression of the event is burned indelibly upon my optic nerves, but oddly absent from my heart. It was many hours before I was cognizant of what we'd done. Days, months, years, before I began to comprehend the magnitude of it. I suppose we'd simply thought about it too much, talked of it too often, until the scheme ceased to be a thing of the imagination and took on a horrible life of its own. Never once in any immediate sense did it occur to me that any of this was anything but a game. An air of unreality suffused even the most workaday details, as if we were plotting not the death of a friend, but rather the itinerary of a fabulous trip that I, for one, never quite believed we'd ever really take. What is unthinkable is undoable. That is something that Julian used to say in our Greek class, and while I believe he said it in order to encourage us to be more rigorous in our mental habits, It has a certain perverse bearing on the matter at hand. The idea of murdering Bunny was horrific, impossible. Nonetheless, we dwelt on it incessantly, convinced ourselves that there was no alternative, devised plans which seemed slightly improbable and ridiculous, but which actually worked quite well when put to the test. I don't know. A month or two before, I would have been appalled at the idea of any murder at all. But that Sunday afternoon, as I stood actually watching one, it seemed the easiest thing in the world. How quickly he fell, how soon it was over. The church had been built in 17-something, according to the National Register of Historic Places. It was an age-blacked, dungeon-like building with its own rickety little graveyard in the back, set on a rolling country lane. When we arrived, cars lined the roads on both sides, as if for a rural dance or bingo night, sloping gently into the grassy ditch. A gray drizzle was falling. We parked near the country club, which was down a bit, and hiked the quarter-mile silently in the mud. The sanctuary was dim, and stepping inside, I was blinded by a dazzle of candles. When my eyes cleared, I saw iron lanterns, clammy stone floors, flowers everywhere. Startled, I noticed that one of the arrangements, quite near the altar, was wired in the shape of the number 27. I thought he was 24, I whispered to Camilla. No, she said, that's his old football number. It was a long service. The minister, who took his ecumenical and, some felt, slightly impersonal remarks from St. Paul's sermon on love from 1 Corinthians, talked for about half an hour. Didn't you feel that that was a very inappropriate text? Said Julian, who had a pagan's gloomy view of death, coupled with a horror of the non-specific. Next was Hugh Corcoran. He was the best little brother a guy could have. Then Bunny's old football coach, a dynamic JC type who talked at length of Bunny's team spirit, telling a rousing anecdote about how Bunny had once saved the day against a particularly tough team from Lower Connecticut. That means black, whispered Francis. The coach wound up his story by pausing and staring at the lectern for a count of 10. Then he looked up frankly. I don't know, he said, a whole lot about heaven. My business is teaching boys to play a game and play it hard. Today, we're here to honor a boy that's been taken out of the game early. But that's not to say that while he was out there on the field, he didn't give us all he had. That's not to say he wasn't a winner. A long, suspenseful pause. Bunny Corcoran, he said gruffly, was a winner. A long, solitary wail went up from somebody toward the middle of the congregation. Except in the movies, Knute Rockne, All-American, I don't know if I've ever seen such a bravura performance. When he sat down, half the place was in tears, the coach included. No one paid much attention to the final speaker, Henry himself, who went to the podium and read, inaudibly and without comment, a short poem by A.E. Housman. The poem was called With Rue My Heart Is Laden. I don't know why he chose that particular one. We knew that the Corcorans had asked him to read something, and I expected that they had trusted him to choose something appropriate. It would have been so easy for him to choose something else, though, something you would think he would pick, for Christ's sake, from Lycidas or the Upanishads or anything, really. Certainly not that poem, which Bunny had known by heart. He'd been very fond of the corny old poems he'd learned in grade school, The Charge of the Light Brigade, In Flanders Fields, a lot of strange old sentimental stuff whose authors and titles I never even knew. The rest of us, who were snobs about such things, had thought this a shameful taste, akin to his taste for King Dons and Hostess Twinkies. Quite often I had heard Bunny say this houseman aloud, seriously when drunk, more mockingly when sober, so that the lines for me were set and hardened in the cadence of his voice. Perhaps that is why hearing it then, in Henry's academic monotone, he was a terrible reader, there with the guttering candles and the draft shivering in the flowers and people crying all around, enkindled in me such a brief and yet so excruciating pain, like one of those weirdly scientific Japanese tortures calibrated to extract the greatest possible misery in the smallest space of time. It was a very short poem. With rue my heart is laden for golden friends I had, for many a rose-lipped maiden and many a light-foot lad. By brooks too broad for leaping, the light-foot boys are laid. The rose-lipped girls are sleeping in fields where roses fade. It was a big cemetery, windy and flat and anonymous. The stones were laid out in rows like tract homes. The uniformed driver of the funeral home Lincoln walked around to open the door for Mrs. Corcoran. She was carrying, I didn't know why, a small bouquet of rosebuds. Patrick offered her an arm, and she slipped a gloved hand in the crook of his elbow, inscrutable behind her dark glasses, calm as a bride. The back doors of the hearse were opened, and the coffin slid out. Silently, the party drifted after it as it was borne aloft into the open field, bobbing across the sea of grass like a little boat. Yellow ribbons fluttered gaily from the lid. The sky was hostile and enormous. We passed one grave, a child's, from which grinned a faded plastic jack-o'-lantern. A green-striped canopy of the sort used for lawn parties was set up over the grave. There was something vacuous and stupid about it, flapping out there in the middle of nowhere, something empty, banal, brutish. We stopped, stood, in awkward little groups. Somehow I had thought there would be more than this. Bits of litter chewed up by the mowers lay scattered on the grass. There were cigarette butts, a Twix wrapper, recognizable. Traffic washed past up on the expressway. The grave was almost unspeakably horrible. I had never seen one before. It was a barbarous thing, a blind, clayey hole with folding chairs for the family teetering on one side and raw dirt heaped on the other. My God, I thought. I was starting to see everything, all at once, with a blistering clarity. Why bother with the coffin, the awning, or any of it if they were just going to dump him, shovel the dirt in, go home? Was this all there was to it? The minister ran through the service fast, his bland face tinted green beneath the canopy. Julian was there. I saw him now, looking toward the four of us. First Francis, and then Charles and Camilla. Charles and Camilla moved to go stand with him, but I didn't care. I was in a daze. The Corcorans sat very quietly, hands in laps. How can they just sit there, I thought, by that awful pit, do nothing? It was Wednesday. On Wednesdays at 10, we had Greek prose composition, and that was where we all ought to have been now. The coffin lay dumbly by the grave. I knew they wouldn't open it, but I wished they would. It was just starting to dawn on me that I would never see him again. The pallbearers stood in a dark row behind the coffin, like a chorus of elders in a tragedy. Henry was the youngest one. He stood there quietly, his hands folded before him. Big, white, scholarly hands, capable and well kept. The same hands that had dug in Bunny's neck for a pulse and rolled his head back and forth on its poor broken stem, while the rest of us leaned over the edge, breathless, watching. Even from that distance, we could see the terrible angle of his neck, the shoe turned the wrong way, the trickle of blood from nose and mouth. He pulled back the eyelids with his thumb, leaning close, careful not to touch the eyeglasses which were skewed on top of Bunny's head. One leg jerked in a solitary spasm, which quieted gradually to a twitch and then stopped. Camilla's wristwatch had a second hand. We saw them silently conferring. Climbing up the hill after her, bracing his knee with his palm, he'd wiped his hands on his trousers and answered our clamorous whispers, "Dead, is he?" with the brief impersonal nod of a doctor. O Lord, we beseech you that while we lament the departure of our brother Edmund Graydon Corcoran, your servant, out of this life, we bear in mind that we are most certainly ready to follow him. Give us grace to make ready for that last hour and protect us against a sudden and unprovided death. He hadn't seen it coming at all. He hadn't even understood there wasn't time. Teetering back as if on the edge of the swimming pool, comic yodel, windmilling arms. Then the surprise nightmare of falling. Someone who didn't know there was such a thing in the world as death, who couldn't believe it even when he saw it, had never dreamed that it would come to him. Flapping crows, shiny beetles crawling in the undergrowth, a patch of sky frozen in a cloudy retina, reflected in a puddle on the ground. Yoo-hoo, being and nothingness. I am the resurrection and the life. He who believeth in me, even if he die, shall live, and whosoever liveth and believeth in me shall never die. The pallbearers lowered the coffin into the grave with long, creaking straps. Henry's muscles quivered with the effort. His jaw was clenched tight. Sweat had soaked through to the back of his jacket. The straps were pulled up. The minister blessed the grave and then sprinkled it with holy water. Dirt and dark. Mr. Corcoran, his face buried in his hands, sobbed monotonously. The awning rattled in the wind. The first spadeful of earth. The thud of it on the hollow lid gave me a sick, black, empty feeling. Mrs. Corcoran, Patrick on one side, sober Ted on the other, stepped forward. With a gloved hand, she tossed the little bouquet of roses into the grave. Slowly, slowly, with a drugged, fathomless calm, Henry bent and picked up a handful of dirt. He held it over the grave and let it trickle from his fingers. Then, with terrible composure, he stepped back and absently dragged the hand across his chest, smearing mud upon his lapel, his tie, the starched, immaculate white of his shirt. I stared at him. So did Julian and Francis and the twins, with a kind of shocked horror. He seemed not to realize he had done anything out of the ordinary. He stood there perfectly still, the wind ruffling his hair and the dull light glinting off the rims of his glasses. Thank you.
There will be now a short intermission of about 10 to 15 minutes. People who want to ask questions to structure that after the intermission can get a little piece of paper with me and then write it down. Perhaps that's the best way to deal with it. So you can get here a little. And the mic, what's about the microphones? Oh yes, there are 2 microphones downstairs, although I can't see them, and there are 2 microphones somewhere in the balcony. That's it? Okay.
I think I have to go back into the green room during our. I feel like we're judging some sort of contest here or something.
There are lots of Julian questions, so that should be a.
And you have your own questions.
And I've got my own questions, and I will probably begin with them, but for one question, which is probably an easy one to go into, not this one, but this one. took you over 8 years to write a book, it's good
Major
to...
what, sorry?
If you major changes during the writing process. So, how was it? 3 years ago. So I'll probably begin with that and then go over to my own questions and then we'll just talk. Huh? Yeah, somebody was Alva, okay. Probably don't have to walk there because there's a microphone outside. Well, we'll start the questioning. Lots of questions have been put on little papers. You've seen us sorting them. There are probably too much even to ask. I've got some questions of myself which I'd like to ask. There are some questions which double with those questions, so they will sort of put in during the interview. I will start with a question from the audience, but I'll first go to the table. When there is time left, we can go to the other questioning by microphone. I hope we reach that point because there are lots of questions on paper. Somebody from the audience asked, it took you over 8 years to write the book, and she asked, could you give us some examples of major changes during the writing process? For example, was the plot different years ago? Should be a way to get this down.
I don't think there is.
No, this is the lowest we can go, I guess.
I'm not going to hold this microphone like Frank Sinatra. I don't know. Can you hear me? Yes. Okay. Good. Major changes.
Major changes. Did the plot of the Secret History change during the writing?
Well, it did somewhat, just because I was very, very. When I started writing it, I had a plot outline, but in starting to write a book this long, it's much better to have some sort of idea where you're going, even if you depart from it, just so you can have some sort of general plan, even so you sort of know what not to do, really. And it did change a lot over the course of years, simply because I was really young and had no clue what I was doing when I was. I don't have much of a clue now, but I had much less of a clue then when I started. And would just wander off into blind alleys and realize that things weren't working, things that I had planned out according to the plot line, and would just realize that I had gone off onto a sidetrack that I shouldn't have gone on. Would have to go back on the main road, figure out. E.L. Doctorow said that writing a novel is like driving cross country with a map. You can really only see as far as your headlights, but it's comforting to have that atlas in the glove compartment. You can look at it if you need to. So that's kind of how the plan of my novel was. And yes, it did change. And the ending is actually different from the slightly different. Same results, but arrived at by a different route.
And the title is different.
The title is different, but that's not my fault. That's the fault of Viking Penguin, actually, because the original title was God of Illusions, and I really wasn't married to that title. I actually didn't even have a title for this the whole time I was working on it. I would kind of call it different things or just my book. And then the night before I handed it in, I had a list of maybe 10 possible titles. I just didn't feel very strongly about any of them. I mean, they seemed that they'd be appropriate in one way or another. And so I took a poll of all my friends. I called up about 10 friends on the telephone and said, which of these do you think is the best? And I had 5 votes for The God of Illusions, so it was the winner. And so when the manuscript went into my agent's office, it was called The God of Illusions. Well, that was okay, but then I don't know. The book was sold to Viking in Britain, and they didn't like that title, and they said, "Would you change it?" And I was happy to do that. I didn't really care about it, and I thought, well, probably the people at Viking Penguin, know more about this than my friends I called on the telephone, and how to sell books and all. So So I thought, well, I was happy to do it, and so I changed it to The Secret History. Well, then Viking Penguin didn't like The Secret History because there's a title in their catalog, Paul Theroux, My Secret History, and they thought, well, this is just too similar. And at this point, my agent and my editor were kind of fed up, and they said, well, we can't be changing the name of this book every 5 minutes. So The Secret History it is.
Yes, and The Secret History, as it is now, the title has been named after a book written in the 6th century by the Greek historian Procopius. Why did you choose the title? Is this gossipy chronicle, which it is does that have anything to do with the story as you tell it, the story Richard Papin has to tell?
Well, it does, because Procopius was an official historian, and he was a historian during the time of Justinian and Theodora, I believe, and during the time they were alive, he wrote these very sort of state-sanctioned histories of, he wrote things that were, he was very much in the regime. But then pretty much the second that Justinian and Theodora died, he wrote The Secret History, which was what was really going on, and not this official history at all. And Justinian was terrible, and Theodora was a whore, and what really was going on.
Sunday paper on.
Yes, exactly. Yes, Andrew Morton. Yeah.
But The Secret History takes its title from a Greek prose work, but it is much more, and there are questions on that too, much more like a Greek tragedy. It is a story of inescapable fate, the downfall of Richard Papin and his friends. They're ruined by their own faults. Well, in every Greek tragedy there's a sort of fatal flaw, something that makes people, go to their ruin. What is the fatal flaw of Richard and his friends? What drives these 5 ordinary students to murder?
Well, individually they're all driven by separate things. That would probably take too long to go into, but collectively, I don't think any of these people would have done this by themselves. The Bacchae, which is the play that I was looking at very much when I was writing this book, is a
That's the play by Euripides?
Yep, and very. It was a play that troubled the Greeks. It wasn't one of Euripides' more popular plays in classical times. We don't have very many plays of his now, but we know that was one that didn't have a very good reception, or as good as some of his others, in his own lifetime. And but it's the Bacchae is a play about hysteria and about how. Well, yes, it's a commonplace in the 20th century, but people in groups, and this was a horrifying idea to the Greeks in a lot of respects, because of the idea of, people were much more sort of civically minded than they are now, and the idea of individualism, which is so important now, wasn't really that important at all to the ancient Greeks. You never find ancient Greek heroes going out and trying to find themselves. This is not a question that it would occur to Achilles to ever ask. He's just and in a way, yes. It's an interesting question, and each one of the components and each one of the murderers are sort of driven by different reasons, but yeah, there are 5 of them. It would take sort of a long time to go into each one, but collectively, yes, it's become a commonplace in the 20th century that people in groups will do things that an individual would never do.
So they have no individual fatal flaw, but they have only a fatal flaw.
They do have individual fatal flaws, which sort of bring them together. But each one of them, Henry's flaw, for instance, is really that he's tried so hard to make himself perfect. He's a very young man, and He's tried so hard to root out things in himself which he finds unpleasant or distasteful, or that he's really managed to tear out a lot of what makes him human as well, a lot of his humanity. His studies aren't tempered by any kind of balance or any sort of...
He's translating John Milton into Latin.
Yes, he's just, completely abstract. There's a point in the novel where one of the characters is talking about during the murder investigation, and that Henry, the main thing he's concerned with is not really, actual conversations with the police about this crime, but what book it looks better, what book would make a better impression for him to carry around. If Thomas Aquinas would make a better impression on these cops than, Homer or something. And the other character says, this was just horrible. If he was the only one that, that the police had to deal with, we just all would have gone to the gas chamber, because... Yes, Henry really believed that, yes, by having the right text with him, this would somehow, make the policeman think that he couldn't have committed this crime. I mean, and the narrator, on the other hand, is driven to his role in it by. He says this. My fatal flaw is morbid longing for the picturesque at all costs. He too is very anxious to reinvent himself, very anxious to forget his past, very, very anxious to become a part of this group.
Would you say it's snobism that leads him to?
Yes, it is
crime?
snobism. Yes, it is. It is snobism in a way, and it's also the fact that he's very naive. He hasn't seen as much of the world as he'd like to pretend he has, and. He's very entranced by these people, but he doesn't really realize until it's far too late what he's gotten himself into. He's completely taken in by the surface of things. This is also what the book is about in a lot of respects, is the difference between appearance and reality, because nothing in this book is really what it seems, Mm-hmm. The narrator is fooled again and again, or is deluded again and again.
We touched upon the Greek in the novel. There's a lot more Greek in it. Classical culture, and especially Greek thought, plays a large role in it. There are the famous conversations in the class of Julian Morrow, the ambitious teacher, the strange teacher, and he's going on and saying, well, beauty is terror, and there is further in the book, there are the famous words, chalapa ta kala, beauty is harsh. What is it? Well, is beauty harsh indeed? Is beauty always terror? Could you say that?
Beauty is harsh in any. There's almost no respect in which it isn't harsh. If you're talking about physical beauty, if you're talking about the beauty of a flower or a beautiful person, it's horrible because it's given completely capriciously. One has no control over it. One's, the fairy's at your cradle or she's not. You have it or you don't, really. The same with a flower. A flower can't help if it's, a rose or a weed. It's just born what it is. And so there's cruelty in the way that it's even doled out, and also it's ephemeral. That's the horrible thing about even to the living things that are lucky enough to be given beauty. It lasts for a very short time. And in manufactured objects, in paintings or in books or in poetry, beauty is also cruel because it's very very remote. It's Keats on a Grecian urn. These figures are cold. They have no sympathy for us. These nymphs dancing around a vase. They really don't speak to human joy or suffering. Something that's beautiful in that sort of eternal sense is outside the realm of humanity and is terrifying to us. I think it's notable that whenever an angel appears in the Bible, every instance, what they have to say, the first thing they have to say is, don't be afraid, don't be afraid, because the people are just completely wigged out and want to run off and don't want to listen to what the angel has to say. So that's always the first, and also, in a certain sense, the terror of, sort of the creator of making, beauty is harsh. Is harsh to the creators of very beautiful objects. Sometimes. So we have beautiful Van Goghs to look at in Amsterdam, but Van Gogh had a pretty hard time. He went through a lot so we could have them. So.
There is a lot of classical culture in The Secret History. You studied Greek philosophy. And, what is it that attracts you in Greek culture? More than in, let's say, Roman culture?
Well, what was attractive to me as you know, I mean, in wanting to write, the Greeks are, I mean, the reason, I mean, every age goes back to the Greeks. Every age has their own interpretation of the Greeks. Victorian England had their Greeks, and the Renaissance had their Greeks, and the Middle Ages had their Greeks, and they're all really kind of different, you know, and every age sort of picks what they like and leaves the rest. But the Greeks were very interesting for a young writer to study, or any young artist, because the Greeks like to show you how things are made. They're very interested in the way things are put together and the structure of things. You know, if you see the Parthenon, this is an example I always use when people ask me this question, but it's so beautiful and simple, it really makes it very plain. The Greeks knew all about the arch, for instance. The Sumerians had invented the arch, you know, a long time before, but they didn't like to use the arch because it was very unclear in an arch what's supporting what. And the Parthenon, you know, which is something that architects return to again and again, you see the way the weight is distributed. You see, you know how even if you know nothing about about architecture at all or about geometry, you know, which is a very Greek idea that that a slave can be made to reason out a geometry problem if you just ask him the right questions. And the Greeks felt that, you know, by showing you these things, you know, that, I mean, they wanted you to understand how it was made. I mean,
So the Greeks sort of helped you to construct your work?
In a very real sense, because novelists the novel's a very new form, obviously, and it's a popular art form, you know, and in a lot of novels that I admire very much, it's very difficult if you're a young writer, because if you're a young writer, you read books the way that a young architect looks at a building. You want to see where the struts are, and you're very interested in the ornamentation and things like that, but you want to see what holds it up. And it's hard to do that with, one of my favorite writers is Nabokov, and there's so much verbal magic. There's so much, he's constantly throwing out smoke screens and putting up mirrors and pulling rabbits out of his hats, and there's just so much. Yeah, so much pyrotechnics, so much technique, and so much ornamentation that you can't really see where that. I mean, though in a novel like Lolita, the structure is there, beautiful, clean, yes, I mean, it's very much there, but it's just very difficult to scrape all that extra away and see, because there's too much covering it. And Greek tragedy is, you know, pretty pure structure. So yeah, that was one reason why I was interested in.
So Greek ideas were very important for your story. Could the story have taken place in a class of, let's say, French students, or?
Well, it could have, but it would have been a different book. You know, it could have been, you know.
So that's a no for a question.
Well, the ancient Greeks are all dead. I think it would have made the French very angry if I had suggested that French ideas had led to these horrible acts.
You would have gotten sued, so.
I would have had my head on a stick.
In A Secret History, you write about the strange cold breadth of the ancient world and about the classical mind, which is narrow, unhesitating, relentless. Are the classics, is Greek culture dangerous to fragile minds?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I don't particularly think so, but you know, I mean, the opening epigram of my book, this quote by Nietzsche. I inquire now as to the genesis of a philologist and assert the following: a young man cannot possibly know what Greeks and Romans are. He does not know whether he is suited for finding out about them. And we all know how poor Nietzsche turned out, you know, what happened to him.
The Secret History is a novel about good and evil, about how seductive evil can be, how lives are ruined by crime. It's a very moralist theme, you could say. Would you call yourself a moralistic writer?
Well, I think in a lot of ways, just the form I've chosen. The novel is, though it is a popular art form, but it's also a very, very moral art form in a lot of ways. I mean, our greatest novels are about sort of depict, I mean, you know, Madame Bovary, Anna Karenina. I mean, these are all about the workings out of moral problems in the real. And I think the reason that novels appeal to us so much is that no matter how much philosophy or we've studied or how religious we are, we can't really assimilate. I think it's very difficult to assimilate these ideas, into our blood, into our daily lives. I mean, whereas something like, if we read it, if we see it dramatized, we understand it so much better. Jesus, in the Bible, whenever he can't get people to, the disciples never understand anything before Jesus tries to tell them. And he always says, he tries to explain, they don't understand. He says, well, let me tell you a story, And this is what he does again and again, parables. I mean, and we understand things so much. I mean, a different example from Buddhism, the story of the burning house. This is a parable that Buddha told, I think, in the fire sermon. But, there's some little children that are in a house, and their mother's going to town, and while she's gone, the house catches on fire, and the little kids are all trapped in the house. And she goes outside, she comes back, and she sees her kids in this burning house, and so she does everything to try to get them to come out, because they're little, and they're scared, and they don't know what to do. And she tries reasoning with them, that doesn't work, they're panic-stricken. She tries yelling at them, threatening them. They're still panic-stricken. And then she has a brilliant idea. She's been to town, and she reaches in her bag, and she pulls out a toy, and the kids are out of the house in a second. And what we can see, when we see these things enacted out, we feel them so much more deeply than if we're, This is why Aristotle is, for me, so much less an effective just affects me much less than Plato does, because Plato's such a great dramatist, and the ideas that he presents have flesh and blood, and they walk around, and we can see them in the context of our own lives. Things are always easier to understand by analogy.
So if you're talking about ethics, you would prefer Dostoevsky or Plato over Aristotle?
Yes, I would. And it's because, it's because I'm a novelist and not a philosopher. Things are always more palatable to me if they're sort of presented in an entertaining form.
Yeah, that was also one of the questions I had. You studied philosophy when you were at Bennington College. And what is it that made you become a writer? Is that because you think you can have more effect by writing a novel than by writing an academic treatise on ethics or moral philosophy?
If I had written an academic treatise, nobody would want to read it. It would be completely uninteresting.
Well,
I have nothing.
Well written.
Well, I wanted to be I studied philosophy because I wanted to be a writer. Writing really came first. This was what I wanted to do. Because I'm young. I'm 28. I don't have any great truths to tell anybody that everybody in this room doesn't already know. Like a lot better than I do. I don't have any special.
But you have a story.
But yeah, it's a story, and that's and the reason that philosophy it was interesting for me to study philosophy, because the great problem of young novelists is that they are young, and novelists really need a lot of experience before they're able to write. Have to know a lot about the world and how people interact and things like that. There are no child prodigies in novel writing, and I think it's really arguable that there are no great novels written by anyone under 40.
Well, this is probably a good time for interaction of the public. Are there any novels written before 40?
People always have examples, but either I haven't read them or I don't think they are.
This is not a good question for public interaction, I guess. Talking about literature, who are your greatest literary examples? We know a little bit about Scott Fitzgerald, not only because you write a little bit like Scott Fitzgerald, but also because in the book, Richard Peyton's favorite novel is The Great Gatsby, and he sees all kinds of parallels between his life and The Great Gatsby. Is Scott Fitzgerald one of your literary examples?
Scott Fitzgerald is somebody I just love to read, return to his books with pleasure over and over again. So, yes, I love him very much, and you know, there are books perhaps that I love less, that I've learned more from, just in sort of a technical sense, but in terms of, you know, sort of the real sort of emotional part of writing and what one responds to oneself. And yeah, what one enjoys reading when one's sick and bad, you know, yeah, very, very much. I love Scott Fitzgerald.
Are there any authors who had a great influence on your writing, so not just for reading, but on your writing?
Yes, a great many of them. Dickens is a great writer for a young novelist to study, because there's almost no problem that Dickens is unafraid to handle. You know, no technical problem. I mean, he really just does everything. And if you think of a specific example of something that's difficult to do, you can always, you know, if you think over Dickens, you can think of an example where he was faced with the same problem, and of course did it beautifully. So he's you know, a great teacher, and also, I mean, just a very sort of benevolent presence. I mean, some writers, I mean, I think it was John Irving who talked about, you know, that it was bad for young writers to become overly obsessed with great figures of the past, and he used this wonderful line, you know, the ghost of the young James Joyce standing horribly at your back, you know.
Looking over your shoulder.
Yes, which of course you'd never want to write again, but this is what I mean, that Dickens is a very benevolent presence, because you don't get that, you don't get that feeling from him. He's kind of...
So nice grandfather.
Yeah, he is. He's very nice. He's very grandfatherly. He's like, okay, good try. Try, you know, try again. You know, not like Joyce, who just...
No. Or T.S. Eliot, for that.
Or T.S. Eliot, I know, who just strike one dumb for the rest of one's life. I mean, just, you know.
So that's the reason why you put him on your answering machine.
And it works. It works. They hang up. They don't call back.
A few questions on your Southern inheritance. You were born and raised in the deep South,
yeah.
Mississippi, the country of William Faulkner. That's the first person we think of.
We too, yeah.
Well, Mark Twain is a good one too, of course.
But in Mississippi,
yes,
Uncle
well,
Bill,
higher,
that's Uncle Bill's country.
Yeah. Did your well, the South has a very, very strong literary tradition, perhaps even stronger than the North or the West or the East.
I think very much so. I mean, definitely. I mean, that's, yeah.
And did your native region influence your writing very much? You wouldn't call yourself a Southern writer, but you are a writer from the South.
Well, people, you know, Oscar Wilde, for instance, is not really an Irish writer. He never writes about the old sod or, you know, County Clare or anything like that, or digging potatoes out in the yard. But
starving.
But he's, I mean, he's just an Irishman through and through and through and through. His humor, his way of telling a story, his extravagance, you know, he's, you know, his teasing, jocular tone. He just is Irish. Just his temperament, even though he doesn't choose to write about Ireland, he's so Irish. You know, that mocking spirit of the Irish is just so. There's not a more Irish writer than he is. Yet he didn't ever write about Ireland.
Mm-hmm. He was a sort of would-be Englishman, you would say.
Well, in a way, yeah, he was, you know, but he wasn't English at all in terms of temperament, or at least the English would wish to have you think so.
Yeah, that's true. So you're a sort of Southern writer in the way he is an Irish writer?
Well, this is something that Flannery O'Connor said, because people are always asking about, you know, if you're a Southerner and you're a writer, people always ask you, you know, aren't you oppressed by the ghost of William Faulkner? Like, you know, and the answer is no. I mean, no more than I'm oppressed by, say, the ghost of Joseph Haydn, you know? I'm glad that he's there. He wrote some great music. I'm not oppressed by this at all. But somebody asked Flannery O'Connor the same question, and how could, you know, this very long, involved question, you know, how could she possibly have anything new to say about the South? Because it had been... Basically, this is a country that belongs to a master, and who had... you know, basically said all there was to say. And, you know, what did what could she, Flannery, possibly add? And she just said, well, you get off the tracks when the Dixie Special comes through,
So, you don't think you will ever write a book about the glorious pre-Civil War past, or race relations, or anything that's typically Southern?
Well, it's possible. Anything is possible. Actually, my new book is set in the South. Mm-hmm. So, So I don't know, but I think it's. But it's the South now is a very, very different place than it was when William Faulkner was writing about it. I mean, there's a whole school of sort of new Southern writing that, we're faced with a whole different set of problems now than William Faulkner had to deal with. I think William Faulkner would be pretty shocked if he walked through Oxford, Mississippi today and saw what, it's very different.
What do these writers deal with then?
Well, race relations have changed just dramatically in the course of my own lifetime. I mean, when I was a little girl, I can remember very clearly, separate entrances at the hospital even, a colored entrance, things like that. Schools were segregated. It was a very different place than it is now, because that's certainly not at all the case now. And I think it's really arguable that, the American South has such a reputation, and rightfully so, of being so full of prejudice and hatred. I mean, Walker Percy called it dark, bloody, mad old Mississippi. But in America now, in the Northeast and in Los Angeles, people are now dealing with problems that Southerners had to deal with maybe, 20, 30, 40 years ago, because, the racial crimes that are now happening in America are not happening in Birmingham, they're not happening in Jackson, they're happening in Los Angeles, and they're happening in New York, because the South, in a funny way, has worked through this. We have a terrible history, a terrible, unforgettable history of racial violence, but it's something that both sides have really learned to live with, and it's a much newer problem, I think, for other parts of the country.
Next is a question which is from the audience. In your book there is not much of these directly Southern themes, but there's a lot of Gothic in the story. Horrible things that happen, although they usually happen off stage. Is Edgar Allan Poe a big influence on you? He's sort of the founder of the Gothic mode in America.
Oh, Edgar, you can't beat him with a stick. He's great. I love him. You
read him before bedtime.
Sometimes I do. Actually, Edgar Allan Poe is very fun to read when you're sick, because he
You get sicker.
You get sicker. You do get sicker. Poe is wonderful. It's just very much an influence, and also he's another writer who I just kind of instinctively love. I mean, just someone I'm very drawn to, just on a very personal level. I mean, someone whose books I really enjoy reading to amuse myself.
This will take a sort of sorting out, because some of the questions I took in my own interview, but now I have to really deal with the questions that are on this table. First one is, hi, I'd like to know in which way you got the idea for your story, and why did you choose this subject?
Well, that's really hard, because it changed over the course of, because I worked on this book for 8 years, and it changed during the writing so many times. 5, 6, 7 years into the writing, I would see a film or read something that I hadn't read before that really would kind of change everything that had gone before. So it wasn't as if I had the whole idea. I had an idea of the plot structure, just the very basic skeleton of this, that it would be about some young people committing a murder and sort of the consequences, but it just sort of, I didn't have just this huge idea in my mind when I began. It began very sketchily and kind of built up over a period of time.
It was not a newspaper clipping or something like that.
No.
This is an hartecrate, as we would say. I took Greek at secondary school for 5 years, but I couldn't speak a Greek sentence to save my life.
This man sounds like a friend of mine.
But the question is, what do they teach you at American schools that makes such a difference that people can converse?
This is why we call it fiction. I mean, you know.
Some questions on the characters. Lots of questions that were put on the paper are about Julian, one of the central characters, not one of the students, but the master of the class in which all these hideous things are worked out. There are a few questions on him. Well, the easiest question for me to begin with at this moment is, could you say a bit more about Julian's role in the story? Because at first he seems very strong and influential, but later on he just moves and he fades away. At least that's what the poser of this question thinks.
Well, Julian in some way is in most ways is sort of the animating presence of this book. I mean, he's the he's where it all begins, but the reason that he's a shadowy presence is that, I mean, it's very deliberate, because, you know, all of these, in the world of this novel, this is a novel where adults are either ineffective or absent or completely horrible. This is, you know, and you know, if you look at I mean, these are very young people you're talking about, and that are the protagonists of this book, and in every single one of them, I mean, 2 of them are actually even orphaned, you know, and they're and Julian is really very much a moral neutral, but he's someone upon whom they all sort of project this desire for a father, and really kind of refuse very strongly to see. Something that I try to do throughout the book is because in the early parts of the book they speak so glowingly of Julian, and I try to give little clues to the fact that this is really not the case. The things that they're telling you about Julian don't quite coincide with the way that he behaves. You know, because if he loves them so much, why do they see him so little? He seems very unconcerned with their, you know, they talk about how he loves them all the time, but he is very removed from their lives in a physical sense. And they have really just tried to you know, he just looks the part. He looks like this wonderful, old, kindly, incredibly cultured gentleman. I mean, sort of the dream parent. You know, it's the parent that you wish that you had, this sort of fairy godfather. And they're all kind of blind to his faults because of that. And that's why when what happens with Julian happens, and it's such a terrible betrayal when it's just thrown in their face. I mean, what they've really refused to see again and again, and have pushed it back, every single one of them, with both hands repeatedly throughout the book.
And then he fades away.
Yes.
In an interview this week, one of the many interviews you gave, you told the interviewer that the characters in The Secret History are based on abstract ideas and principles. Could you say what the abstract idea behind the character of Julian is then?
Well, the abstract, I read when I was in college, actually when I was studying Dickens, there's a book called Authority by Richard Sennett, which is largely about it has nothing really to do with what we're talking about here, but the opening quote is, Sennett says that people are always attracted to authority figures whom they secretly do not feel to be legitimate. You know, it's a book about dictatorship and about political power. And, so, I mean, it's a very hazy, it's not an abstract idea that, you know, it's not as if Julian stands for, you know, truth or some, you know, sort of very, very simple sort of, I mean, that was...
He's just a charismatic...
Yeah, a charismatic figure. I mean, frequently charismatic figures are very empty. I mean, charismatic figures are frequently all surface. You know, there's nothing there, and that makes them more powerful, the fact that they are all surface, because you can project whatever you want to upon them. Everybody has different things that they want in different people, and the more sort of blank someone is, the more they're able to reflect back your own desires. I mean, Julian is described in the book as being like a mirror. He's very brittle, he's very shallow, but he creates this illusion of warmth and depth like a mirror does. Any emotion you throw at him, he throws right back at you, and you get the sense that and he really is just sort of imitating in a way, but you get the sense that he understands you perfectly, because he somehow is picking up what you want from him and throwing it back at you.
He would make a great dictator, I understand.
Well, at the end of the book, you know, there's a story that Julian has gone off to has been hired by a royal family somewhere in Africa, and they, you know, which turns out to be a rumor, but you know, they're all enchanted by this idea. You know, maybe he'll bring up, you know, like Aristotle did, bring up a man who will conquer the world. You know, they say, you know, I don't know what I would be if Julian had got hold of me when I was 8 years old. So.
Well, there are two questions dealing with Julian. And the first one is, what happens to Julian after he leaves campus? We've heard that this is a rumor. And the other one is, are you saving up for the sequel because he's so underdeveloped in the book? So is there going to be a Secret History 2 or a Secret History 3?
I don't think so. I don't think there's going to be a Secret History 2. I'd have a hard time. I would no. That's not happening. Not unless I really just am broke and desperate and just really need the money very badly someday. Yes. Squander it away. I mean, but what was the first part of the question?
Well, that's always with fictional characters, obviously a very difficult question to deal with, because the question is what happens with him after he leaves campus?
After a character leaves the world of the book, the author doesn't know any more about them than the reader does. I mean, all I know about is what's in the book. I mean, it's really true. Yeah. I don't know either.
Another question that pops up more than once in the questions I have on the table is, why did you choose to write the story from a male point of view while you are obviously a female author?
Well, for a very technical reason, it was obvious to me from the outset that this book had to be told from the point of view of a first-person narrator. It was essential that one never know what the other characters are thinking. There couldn't be an omniscient viewpoint. You could never go into Henry's mind or into Julian's, because this is a novel of how the narrator is sort of gradually drawn into this and gradually fooled, and the reader should be fooled along with him. So I knew that I needed a first-person narrator, and the reason that I made the first-person narrator male was simply because the eyes of the narrator are the only pair of eyes that I have in the book, and
wouldn't a pair of female eyes?
No, they wouldn't have, because if you think about it, a character like Bunny, for instance, wouldn't have really been his real self around a woman. He would have been a very different character around. He would have behaved very differently towards a young woman who had joined the class and he would have been, I think, much less himself. I mean, I think he would have, restrained himself much more. I think you would have seen a better side of him that was probably less true. The same with Henry. I think that you just wouldn't have been able to see these characters as clearly as you would have from the point of view of a young man. And also, I didn't want to bring the question, if the narrator had been a young woman, there would have been, always the question, well, obviously there's some sexual attraction that she has to Henry or to Julian, and I didn't want to bring that in at all, because it's not. I mean, and if she had been a woman, that question would have been asked. It just would have been, and not necessarily something I wanted to concentrate.
You once called The Secret History a novel about repressed sexuality. Is that what it is?
In a lot of ways, it is. I mean, in some respects, it is. I mean, because. Yes, I mean, the sexuality in the book just kind of bursts out at these sort of weird points, and there's never a sex scene or anything like that. But I mean, in a way, I mean, that's what the Baki is about, you know, just sort of repression. And, you know, if you repress anything for too long, it will eventually kind of come out in some way you're not expecting it and don't want it to. I mean, I think it's no accident at all that, you know, serial killers, I mean, you know, civilians, you know, not kings and queens, you know, who sort of went around killing people. The first time that we see these are in Victorian England. You know, this is the first time they...
society.
Yes, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. It wouldn't have been so much fun for Dr. Jekyll to turn into Mr. Hyde had he not lived in Victorian England. You know what I mean? He could have just been Dr. Jekyll and gone out and done these things, and no one would care.
Much easier. And there are two questions about the names in the book. The first one is it mere coincidence that Henry, the evil one, is named after Lord Henry from the picture of Dorian Gray?
Well, it is coincidence, but it's an interesting question because, I mean, you know, something else that this book is, you know, concerned with is sort of the ideal of the dandy, sort of the self-centered one. I mean, you know, one of the characters, I think the friend, not Dorian, but Dorian's friend says of Lord Henry Wotton, you know, he never says a right thing and he never does an incorrect thing. He's, I mean, the persona of the dandy is very controlled and very, very stylized, and I mean, very sort of kabuki-like, unreal presence, and that's what these young people are trying to, or Henry in particular, is moving towards, but is kind of unable to get at. Julian is a perfect example. Julian is very like Lord Henry Wotton, who's also a moral neutral, and in the book, I mean, in the picture of Dorian Gray.
The other one is Bunny, whose nickname, I guess, has associations with the writer and critic Edmund Wilson from, I think it's the 30s of this century. The fact that Bunny's real name is Edmund Corcoran, strengthens the association. Is there any connection, or is it an homage to Edmund Wilson?
Well, it's not, but it's an interesting point to bring up anyway. I mean, because I don't like Edmund Wilson, and we almost always disagree invariably. So maybe it's some unconscious thing.
Well, then there's a so-called short and simple question, and that is, are you Bunny?
I wouldn't be here if I was.
And I've got two questions on the table which I can't read, so that's a bit difficult. I think there's a little bit time to get to the microphones. Before that, I want to ask one last question that is here, and it's a very dear question, you could say, and that is, don't you miss the characters enormously now that you've finished the book?
I do miss them. Actually, I don't miss them so much on book tour because it's like I'm working on the book again. I get to talk about them all the time, so they're very much with me still. But you know, there's some deaths that occur in the book, and you know, it was always when somebody died, it was a sad day's work. I didn't like that. It was.
Well, there is the possibility of, I guess, about 10 minutes of questioning by microphone. Perhaps the best thing is to have the two questions I still have on the table, if the people want to step forward, those who haven't heard their question asked yet. It's difficult for me to see because there is a lot of light on the... Sorry. It was a horrible pen. That's the reason why it wasn't... Yes, you can ask a question now.
One question about the character of Julian.
Mm-hmm.
Can everybody hear what is being said in the microphone?
Can you repeat it afterwards?
Yes, well, I'll try.
The character of Julian is a fictional one, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
But why? How does that relate to his being mentioned by George Orwell, who is not a fictional character?
That's the great thing about books. We can make fiction and
Okay.
and fact collide.
Oh yeah, good. Okay, thanks. I mean, George Orwell wouldn't wouldn't think or ask you what have I got to do with this character?
I don't know if he would or not, but it's something that I think has been used very effectively in novels before. Historical characters, actual historical characters, wandering in and out of in and off the stage of fictions. I think it's Nabokov does it several times in Lolita very effectively, I think. At one point he makes pretty clear reference to the tennis player Bill Tilden, and he and Lolita, when they're staying at a tourist camp, come upon Bill Tilden, who's famous in America for being a pederast. He was the great tennis player who completely, ruined his career because he had Umbert's same inclinations. And there's one of my favorite parts in Lolita is when Lolita and Humbert are traveling around. They actually find Bill Tilden, teaching tennis at some resort, broken man, I'm sure, and it's a wonderful sort of, it's a wonderful moment to think of Bill Tilden, who every American knows, gorgeous Bill, teaching Lolita how to play tennis,
So that's just a liberty you can take as a novel writer?
I think so. I think you can take pretty much any liberty you want.
Well, there's another question about the state of frenzy this group of Henry is going to enter in order to experience that bacchanal. I don't know how you pronounce it in English. That's it. They have to get in a sort of state, and they experience sort of a difficulty getting there, which I think is very clear thinking, because that's what I was thinking. How do they get there in that state? But I do not find the answer in the book. Exactly. I mean, they get there, but how? I don't know.
Well, as Henry says, when Richard is questioning him about it, Henry tries to explain again and again, and Richard is not satisfied with his answer, and finally Henry is exasperated, and he says, well, it's not called a mystery for nothing.
So it is still a mystery how to...
It is. It's basically a supernatural event which occurs in the context of what otherwise is a fairly realistic novel. But, there are, what may or may not be ghosts throughout the course of the book. It's not completely a novel that's grounded in, empirical reality.
Okay, I thank you.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions?
Yes, I'd like to ask something.
They're upstairs.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Okay, well, I'm studying Plato in school right now, and in the book it sort of seems sometimes like Plato is speaking. Julian shows his students really very beautiful things, and they get sort of in another world. Like it's like he shows them real truth, but it's not true. And then it sort of seems like the ideal Platonic kind of study and the relationship between the student and the teacher. But other parts are like really mythical, because the relation between a sister and a brother, it's something my other classmates say that's really Greek. But Greeks mostly, they didn't accept it. They had it in myths.
Yeah, it was in myths. It wasn't But, these young people aren't ancient Greeks. They aren't seeing things in the context of actual ancient Greeks. They're seeing things in bits and pieces, in fragments through centuries, and they are, from this distance in time, it's hard to tell what's real and what's not. We're not sure if there was even really a Socrates. Back to the epigram, a young man cannot possibly know what Greeks and Romans are.
Yeah. Because I thought it would have been more like what the Greeks had if they fell in love with Julian. That would.
Well, in a way, they all do. They do love Julian. That's part of the effect that's why Julian has such a hold over them. Which is certainly Socrates' effect upon his pupils. They love him. That's why they'll do anything for him and work really very hard. And and sit up all night when they want to go to sleep. And that's a very Greek idea that we learn better from someone we love. Also the idea, very Greek idea that we learn by imitation, by imitating the good around us we see. What they're imitating is just a false good. They think it's a good. Something else that Plato says is that the really evil man is an evil man who has the appearance of being good, that this is true evil. Because a really evil man who manifests himself as being evil in the world, who's obviously evil, is sort of a warning light. He's sort of a beacon to warn, because we, as the Greeks thought, we wouldn't do wrong if we knew it was wrong. We all try to do the good as we see it, but some of us are deluded, and that's why that's where evil comes from. So.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks.
Any other questions? There is, I think, still one question on the table which we can't read.
That's a question I put there.
You're not on the You're not on the microphone, but you can probably shout.
Where are you?
I think they're in the third balcony.
Oh, hi.
Behind the lights.
It has to do with something somebody just touched on a moment ago, of books cross-referencing each other. I noticed that the idea of a weird classics group who are either out murdering farmers or worshipping the devil appears in one of Bret Easton Ellis's novels.
Mm-hmm.
So that idea was already kicking around in Bennington.
Well, it was... Bret Ellis and I have known each other since we were about 18 years old, and when we were 18, 19, we were both writing novels, so we took a novel writing tutorial together, and he was working on Less Than Zero, and I was working on The Secret History, and so we were familiar with each other's books, and and it was kind of funny because he wrote 3 books in the time it took me to write one. I was 7 years later after he had published all these books. I was still kind of plodding away at this one. But it's that's from our old student days. It's not a nod to anything that's that was at actual historical Bennington College, but it's a reference to the book that he knew that I was writing.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Anyone near a microphone for a last question? Oh, wait a minute. 2 or 3 questions at the same time, I guess.
No, just one. I've been wondering about the kind of prologue, the first part you read.
Mm-hmm.
To me, it feels a bit like a reconstruction or a construction to give the rest of the story somewhat more suspense. Is it?
Well, yes. It's put there for a reason. A lot of times, it's very good in terms of suspense. It would have been. I would have had a harder time keeping suspense in this book if it had begun with my narrator coming to a school and meeting these people that he was very attracted to, but because the prologue exists, from the very moment you see Bunny, he's a dead man, and from the very first time you see him, and the mystery really is why. How do they get to this point where they kill him? It's not a mystery at all that he dies, but it's how they arrive at this point.
Was the conception from the first point you started, or did you later on?
It was at the first point I started, because actually when I started writing this book, I didn't have the prologue and then a straight run to the end. I had a very tricky back and forwards time sequence. Actually, when the novel began, when I was first working on it, it started with the murder itself, with the actual murder, and then the rest of the book was told in flashbacks. And this was just a nightmare. It was just a technical nightmare. I had a really hard. I worked on it that way, trying to switch back and forth and flashbacks, and then coming back to the present. I worked on it in that form for. Must have been at least 4 years and got nowhere at all. And then I came up with the idea of having the prologue, which I actually just wrote very quickly in, I think, even a night. And it was funny because even though everything I had told out of sequence, once I had that in place, it was very easy to go back and put the things in the order of real time, because you knew that anyway. I mean, that was what was so hard, having to keep the order of real time in your head, and figuring out when to spring surprises and things like that. And it's something you know very naturally if you tell a story from beginning to end. It's much harder if you choose to, sort of skip back and forth. And I just wasn't able to do it.
Okay, you were really speaking with two voices, or is there somebody there who still wants to ask a question?
I have one question. How many hours a day do you write?
4 usually if I'm at home. It's hard to write when I'm out doing stuff like this, but I get up in the morning, I work for 4 hours, and sometimes the work goes well, and if it does go well, I stay and work until I'm tired of working. Other days, most days, at the end of the 4 hours, I'm pretty glad to get up and go have some lunch, so...
That's it.
Okay.
Well, I think we have to conclude here. It's late. I thank Donna Tartt for her answering the questions.